Tonight on Nation to Nation, forced or coerced sterilization. Over 100 Indigenous women say it's happening in Canada.
We should be outraged as Canadians that it's happening, because this is about a value judgment about who gets to give birth in this country and who doesn't.
There's a lawsuit and the Senate is looking into it. But what about a criminal investigation?
If people were having things done without informed consent, that's breaking the law.
It all comes down to imagining the unimaginable.
Hoping for, that beautiful experience that having a child is or ought to be. And they are leaving unable to have any more against their will.
I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation. It's almost completely unimaginable. You go to the hospital to give birth and leave never being able to do so again. It's being called forced or coerced sterilization. And over 100 Indigenous women have put their name to paper saying it happened to them. We have the lawyer representing the women coming up later in the show. But first, we take this to our political panel of MPs. It's an issue that the Status of Women Committee looked at briefly before last Christmas, and the Senate has started its own study just last week to see exactly how widespread the issue is. So joining us today is Mark Miller, Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Cathy McLeod, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and Rachel Blaney, NDP MP. Welcome to Nation. Mr. Miller, I'll start with you right off the top. Is this a crime and meet the International Convention on Torture, as the United Nations has said?
Look, forced sterilization is a gross violation of someone's human rights. It is unacceptable in any society, particularly in one as advanced as Canada. The fact that it's happening to Indigenous women makes it even more so despicable. We encourage anyone who's had this happen to them to step forward and contact the RCMP or the authorities and report it. It is an issue that I wouldn't find any partisanship in this. We are, as a government, seized of it. There is a Senate Human Rights Committee that is going to study it. It requires close cooperation because of the division of powers with provincial authorities, territorial authorities, to ensure that this absolutely cannot and should not happen.
Ms. McLeod, your colleague Arnold Viersen in that Status of Women Committee I mentioned earlier brought up that if this was wartime, Canada could be accused of a crime against humanity. Do you agree with that?
I'm certainly not an expert in terms of international conventions, but I think we all share the horror when the story came out, and I think, Mark's right. This is not a partisan issue. This is a horrific issue. It came to light. I'm really glad that the Senate is going to be doing a look at it. I think the criminal case or the court case is going to also maybe have us look at next steps. So I don't see that as an end. I see it as a really important reflection. Let's understand the scope of the issue. Let's understand what's happening, because quite frankly, in this day and age, it was absolutely appalling.
Ms. Blaney, should the medical professionals involved in this be held criminally responsible?
I think first of all we have to talk about the core issue, which is how is it in this day and age this is happening to Indigenous women. I know women who were in residential school who were sterilized, and they spoke to me about that experience of being told they had to go to the doctor, had to go to the hospital for a minor surgery, and when they were brought back to the residential school told that they were no longer going to be able to have children. And I think it's just appalling that it's still happening today, and we should be outraged as Canadians that it's happening, because this is about a value judgment about who gets to give birth in this country and who doesn't, and that is absolutely wrong. So I think that those folks need to be held to the highest account. I think we need to make sure that we find out what the core issue is in this country that's happening, that's allowing this to continue to happen, and that we make sure that it doesn't happen again, because this is something we should all be concerned of. And I know that so many people who talk about reconciliation, that this is happening in this day and age. How do we have hope for reconciliation? Because this is about value, and Indigenous people in this country have been told they don't have value for far too long. This is shocking, and I think that we should, as all of us in this place, be completely outraged, and we should all be looking at this seriously.
Mr. Miller, of course, as you even mentioned, there is a lawsuit that's been going on for just over a year. Why should the federal government be fighting this still?
Look, I'm not going to get into the particulars of the lawsuit. I share my colleagues' outrage at what's going on. It is exactly, as in my mind, as they describe it. I mean, we do have to get to the core of the issue, and if there is something systemic going on, weed it out, ensure that it never happens again. But again, we need to get to the truth. We need to see what's going on, ensure that people are held to account, and that the practice is prevented. When you talk about two core things about identity, so one, taking away someone's children, and then in the first place not letting childbirth occur, these are just egregious examples of things that should not happen in any developed country, again, let alone Canada.
Do we need some sort of legislation? I know it's probably too late for this Parliament, but is this something that should be looked at in the future?
We should, if there's an issue of a criminal law being broken, we should actually enforce it to its fullest extent, and then as we address the systemic issues that arise, make sure that they're addressed fully and completely with the full attention of all Canadians, including all officials and the medical profession.
Ms. McLeod, as somebody who's in the medical profession before, I mean, how can you imagine giving birth and afterwards being pressured or forced to have a tubal ligation, for example?
I mean, I can't. Women making decision around, when they want to have children, when they don't want to have children, is fundamental to their core. Medical consent, I mean, I just can't imagine how, medical consent for any procedure is absolutely fundamental to what my training was. So I think, we need, I'll just welcome the Senate investigation. I welcome that the lawsuit needs to get to the bottom of what happened and how you could go forward with a procedure without proper consent that just doesn't happen. So I don't think we need new laws. I think if people were having things done without informed consent, that's breaking the law.
Of course, it's going to go on past the next federal election. Do you foresee this being an issue if there's a change in government?
I think as you hear, we are all equally appalled. I think we all welcome the work. The Senate does have the ability to live through different governments, and I perceive that they need to really, really do a fundamental job on this issue.
Ms. Blaney, back in December, of course, the NDP really pushed this issue forward in committees. A few months later, how satisfied are you with where we stand now?
Well, first of all, I really want to recognize the brave women that have come forward to tell these stories. I think we cannot say enough for their bravery. When you're put in a position, and there's stories, and we've all heard them, of women who are saying, please, I don't want it done, and the doctor pushing them in the door anyways, to come forward with those very private, painful things, that's really hard. Frankly, I don't think enough has been done. I would have loved to see this study in one of the committees. I proposed it at the Indigenous Affairs Committee, was hoping that we could just look at this, because it really speaks to that core problem, which is systemic racism, that is so hard for us to put a pin in. And we need to start being brave enough in this country to start doing that important work, because until we actually identify what that is and start pushing on those things, we need to create a culture in this whole country that Indigenous lives are important, and that we don't get to say or do things to people just because we think that they are the people that are so often unheard. So I would like to see more action.
Does that mean the federal government actually has to get actively involved, whoever is the government, a few years hence from now?
Well, yes, because all levels of government in this country have to take responsibility for the fact that colonialism happened here in this country. And I've said this before, and I will say it again. The Indigenous history of this country has been held by Indigenous people for far too long. This has to be held by all people in Canada. We have to understand that we were all part of it. Whether it was then or it's today, we were all part of it, and the results that we're seeing today in this country are because of that long history. And if you can't see it in that context, that's a real big problem, and that's a problem that Canadians have to own.
Well, we'll no doubt be revisiting this issue later on, but right now it's time for a break. We'll be back with our MPs shortly. Welcome back. The end of this Parliament grows ever nearer, as an election is expected next October. So when it rises for its summer break at the end of June, some 20 or so active pieces of legislation may die on the order paper. At risk are the Indigenous Languages Act and child welfare reform. But the SNC-Lavalin scandal has certainly disrupted the House of Commons, and the Liberal government has been increasingly using time allocations to limit debate, accusing opposition parties of using deliberate stalling tactics. Ms. MacLeod, I'll start with you this round. Earlier this week, House Leader Bardish Chagger blamed the opposition for doing all it can to disrupt government business. Your response?
You know, the fact that we are into the last 7 or 8 weeks of this Parliament and finally we're getting critical legislation, you know, the government's lack of planning does not constitute an emergency on our part. I mean, our committee has been willing, able, ready to look at this legislation for years. We've had very little work that's been sent forward to us from Parliament. You know, certainly we're in a difficult time in Parliament right now. You know, there's certainly emotions running very, very high. But I want to give you an example. The government said that 91 and 92 is absolutely critical to them, and that, you know, the Conservatives are delaying it. I fully expected yesterday would be debating C-92 and that it would be time allocated and it would be coming to committee. Instead, we had C-88. So you know, that was absolutely stunning. This is supposed to be a priority for the government, and then they put out another piece of legislation. So I don't even know when they plan to get this to the table. They do have all the tools in the toolbox to make sure they get it done, but clearly there's something going on when they're putting C-88 up and they're saying C-92 is a priority, which is, of course, the child welfare legislation. But our committee has been ready, willing, and able to do the work that needs to be done, and the government doesn't seem to be able to manage the House.
Mr. Miller, I'll get your response to Ms. MacLeod.
Well, on one specific item, C-88 is very, very important for Indigenous people, treaty holders, Satu Dene, Litchfield, a number of the First Nations that are in the north. So it's an important piece of legislation in and of itself. When we talk about Indigenous pieces of legislation, we've learned that we cannot do things alone and ram down pieces of legislation. That's been tried in the past and has been a massive failure. So the results of the legislation that we put forward with Child and Family Services has been the result of the consultation tables that have told us that that is one of the top issues that concern First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and so that's very important to have a cooperative process. So too with the Indigenous Languages Act. You know, as to all the stalling tactics and that have been used by the opposition, I'm willing to consider that water under the bridge. We've all spent sleepless nights voting through line items of the budget that we voted for, and the opposition parties voted in consequence, and sometimes against. That's happened. It's the result of a number of issues, but the reality is for this government, we've introduced about 80 or so pieces of legislation. 65 of them have received royal assent. We're very proud of that record. But there are very important pieces of legislation to go through, the ones that I've just named, and many other. And so I hope that there will be cooperation and a lack of partisanship to push through the business of government, which is, at the end of the day, is important for all Canadians.
Ms. Blaney, again, the House Leader accused the NDP of actually holding hands with the Conservatives Party. But wouldn't legislation important to Indigenous people get forward if, wouldn't it not get forward without limiting debate, though?
Well, I think we need to take a step back, which is, you know, we can have the House Leader of the government throw accusations at the opposition parties, and there's been several thrown at the NDP that I find extremely frustrating. You know, earlier in this Liberal member's comments talking about what the opposition parties voted against. Well, we were thoughtful in our votes, and we voted very strongly in support of the things that mattered and not in some of those things. And so it's sort of an interesting thing to sort of get lumped up and not really look at the issue. And the other part is SNC-Lavalin is a very, very important issue. So we need to address that. And, you know, the NDP has been very strong in asking for a public inquiry because Canadians want to know what the heck just happened. And there still isn't clarity around that, no matter what the government side tries to persuade people.
I'll agree with that.
And so one of these challenges, and I want to also speak to the fact that as the co-vice chair for the Indigenous Affairs Committee, I believe we've been very cooperative. We're trying to do what we can to do the work in our committee to get that back on the legislative agenda when it comes to us. And so that means a lot of extra work for the members in that committee, and we're willing to do that because we believe in making sure that Indigenous children get treated better in this system in Canada. But at the end of the day, if the consultation legislation process didn't go well, and they had to go back and do it again because they didn't do their work. It's sort of like the same issue that we saw with the Trans Mountain pipeline, where the court said, look, that isn't consultation, that's note-taking. That's something that this government has to be held to account. And so hopefully we'll see these things pass. We know that Indigenous children in care absolutely deserve to be treated better. We need to see a strategy that's actually going to work. You know, it's very frustrating in the communities that I've lived in and that I represent, where kids are being taken away in a very continuous process, and they want to be part of that voice. And so we want to see that legislation happen. But I won't hold the responsibility for the government's work.
Ms. McLeod, do you think, as Mr. Miller suggested, that this can be water under the bridge now and we can actually move forward faster as we head to the end of June?
There is some critical unanswered issues around the SNC, and I think the opposition has very few tools to hold the government to account, and we've determined that when you're talking about interference in a criminal prosecution, it's one of those fundamental things that we do need to hold the government to account on. Now, having said that, the tools, they have a majority government. The tools in the toolbox are theirs, and so and something as simple as if you wanted to get 92 to committee, it should have already been there, and it's not. So I think they need to look very carefully at the weeks that are left and figure out how they're going to deal with the important pieces of legislation. And certainly, for things like Indigenous languages, we were very cooperative in terms of making sure, because we knew it was important. So it's totally in their hands. They have the tools in the toolbox. We have a very few tools to express continued concern regarding SNC Lavalin.
Mr. Miller, I'll give you the last word on this issue. You do, of course, have a majority government. So what is it that the opposition parties are doing to stall legislation?
Well, as I mentioned, the all-night voting, I actually do recognize the line item cooperation that we've gotten from the NDP, particularly on Indigenous issues. I never understood the rationale of rejecting particularly funding for Indigenous peoples is particularly compelling for your viewers by the Conservatives. There should be thought process. If there's enough thought to have all-night voting, there should be some thought put into the way you vote. So I find that distressing. That those pieces of legislation, they're extremely important, and I do hope to move on. Viewers should also note, and I've highlighted in a previous show, that close to 25% of the new funds in the budget is earmarked for Indigenous peoples, and that's something we can be extremely proud of. But the legislative agenda does need to continue, and we'll be prepared to use the instruments that we have in our toolkit to make sure that Canadians are well served. Okay,
we're out of time. You guys are going away for a couple of weeks. When you come back, I've said this before, maybe things will be different, but I said it before and it wasn't different, especially regarding the scandal. But thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
After the break, we'll speak to the lead lawyer for the forced sterilization class action lawsuit. Welcome back. Last week, the Senate Committee on Human Rights did start its study on forced sterilization. And its first witness was lawyer Elisa Lombard. She's the attorney for about 100 women who have launched a class action lawsuit. The defendants are the Attorney General of Canada, the Saskatchewan government and its health authority, as well as several doctors. I interviewed Lombard before her appearance at the Senate for APTN National News, but only used a few very short clips. Here's a longer look at what Lombard had to say.
I think it really has to do with my understanding from my client's perspective is the sense of powerlessness, the sense of not being heard, not being listened to, and not having equal access or benefit to those things, to those tenets, those pillars of consent, as we call them in law, so that they can make these informed decisions about themselves in the appropriate environment, in a time where they're not stressed out or in the throes of labor, for example, free from coercion. And so I think that is really the course that jumps out, is that when you examine an experience, you say, oh, there are so many places in that experience where things should have been done differently, where she should have been asked some questions, where these questions should have been asked before or after or not at all. And so I think that that's what continuously jumps out. In our review of various medical records, we've also seen numerous references to race, to the woman being a single mother, unemployment, for example, but this is not always the case. And so these are some of the factors that really concern us. But I would say that the really resounding chorus for us is that you have women who are going in to have children in publicly funded hospitals, hoping for, you know, that beautiful experience that having a child is or ought to be, and they are leaving unable to have any more against their will. And if anyone who's familiar with the experience of childbearing and you know, giving life to a child, it's chaotic. It's not a time where you can have these long, lengthy conversations about what you want to do for the rest of your life, or make any kind of permanent decisions in that regard. You're also in some of the most intense pain of your life.
Lombard has no doubt about what she hopes the Senate study achieves.
It is very important that the practice stops, which means that preventative measures have to be put into place. The United Nations Committee Against Torture was unequivocal and extremely clear in its recommendations to Canada about what it must do to prevent forced and coerced sterilization, which it has called torture. And so it has said, you must prevent, you must take measures, specific measures, to prevent this from happening. And the survivors of this horrific and heinous practice deserve a measure of justice, as do their families. And so we have our marching orders. We know exactly what it is that we must do. With regards to legal actions, of course, class actions or any kind of legal action is but a part of what must be done to fix big problems. And so, though our efforts are very focused in that regard, my clients understand that there's a much bigger picture to all of this, and that we all have a role to play in really fixing those parts of the system that are broken, to make sure that young Indigenous girls aren't having this same issue. We've been contacted by women who this has happened to their mother and to their daughter. And so the practice has not been broken through time because nothing has been done to prevent it.
Lombard remains cautious about whether or not elected officials in Ottawa or the provinces can do anything immediately.
Well, I'm hopeful, but I'm not naive. And so as far as cynicism goes, I believe that I will have it until we see some tangible measures that are being taken and some meaningful change that is being implemented. Because, of course, that is the only thing that I can go to my clients with. If I tell my clients, and I have, you know, that the Senate is conducting a study, and, you know, they're very pleased with that, and it's good to see that institutions are taking an interest and are investigating things, and hopefully meaningful change will come. But that meaningful change cannot be so far into the future that it becomes meaningless. And for my clients, I have to say that they are seized by now, and they are seized by immediate change, and they are seized by a want to breathe some measure of relief of having gone through all of this. And so I don't know if that's cynicism or if it's realism.
That's our show for the week. But if you missed any part of it, or you want to hear a past episode, check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamourant. Thanks for watching.